I am so excited for this conversation. I have written a memoir. My memoir is called Orange is the New Black. And that was a scary thing. I am sharing the stage today with 4 amazing memoirists, 4 dazzlingly different and immersive, engaging, fascinating, beautiful stories, beautifully told in really different ways. And so we're going to get into it. We're going to chop it up. The title in the program is a little sort of, 30,000 foot, but I will say, when I was finishing the first draft of my memoir, I remember it was in the last week. I knew I was about to finish. I was all alone. I borrowed somebody's mom's house, which was empty, and I woke up in the middle of the night having a full-blown panic attack. And I was like, the federal government, I'm going to publish this book, and the federal government is going to plant drugs in my house and send me back to prison for the rest of my life. And, a sort of frantic phone call, at a, early but acceptable time to a friend, like they calmed me down. I will say, though, that the through line of these 4 beautiful memoirs is family. And it takes a very special kind of bravery to write about your family. So I am frankly in awe of what the 4 of you have undertaken in your incredible books. I'm going to very quickly introduce our panelists. We have Sylvia Brownrigg, who is the author of The Whole Staggering Mystery. We have Tarek El-Ariss, who is the memoirist who has written Water on Fire. Leta McCollough Seletzky, who wrote The Kneeling Man. And Grace Prasad, who wrote The Translator's Daughter. I would love it. When I teach memoir writing, I teach incarcerated writers, and I teach narrative nonfiction because that's the only thing I know how to do. So I always talk about having some sense of the intention of your writing, because having a sense of what the intention of your writing, the reason that you want to do it, because it's hard, is very important. Because particularly in long form, that is the thing that will keep you going when you really want to stop. So I wonder if each of you would just share with us a little bit. It's an audacious thing to write a memoir. It's a very brave thing to write a memoir that is a family story. So if each of you could just tell us a little bit about the intention of your writing as you chose this book to start. Sylvia, would you go first? All right.
Hello. Yeah. Thank you, Piper. Thank you to the fellow panelists, and really appreciate you all coming out, and hope you're not baking. So that's a great place to start. I wanted to say first that this is my first work of nonfiction. I am usually a novelist, and one of the things I believe about novels is that they will be more alive if you are discovering something yourself as a writer, and you haven't made up your mind ahead of time where the book is going to take you. And I think I might have thought from a distance that a memoir would be different than that you would know where you were going in a memoir, because after all, it's based on your life. But I found the same thing to be true with The Whole Staggering Mystery, that I had to allow the book and the telling to show me where to go. The originating incident of this book was that about 12 or 13 years ago, an aunt in Los Angeles found in a family basement a package that was addressed to my father, which was strange because my aunt was my maternal aunt, and my father and mother had been divorced by that point for over 50 years. So it was unclear why there was something addressed to my father in Los Angeles. It was also clear that it was really overdue and that it was his to receive. So my brother and I brought this up to my father, assuming that he would open it and find out what was in this package, which he did not do then. He waited for a few more years until he was by then he was 82 or 83, and his cognitive state was beginning to decline. And so at that point, we kind of asked him and my stepmother to open this package, and inside was this remarkable trove of family documents about my father's father. His father, he had not known his father. His father died when he himself was a child. And so this was a person, my grandfather was somebody I knew really nothing about, because my father also left our family when I was born. So the subtitle of my book is A Story of Fathers Lost and Found. And writing this story was a way of trying to reconstruct the life of my English grandfather, who was a novelist and a very interesting and colorful person, and my father, who in a completely different way was also a very vivid character, who lived off the grid in Northern California for over 25 years. So the story of this book was me learning how to weave together the lives of these two very different men and how they actually were related to one another. That's my best summary.
Thank you. Tarek, the intention.
Intention. Well, I'm a scholar of literature, so I'm usually the one who interprets texts, but I also work with a lot of artists and conceptual artists. So at some point, when they've invited me to write something a little more personal. Say, why don't you write about your city? Why don't you write about something a little more personal? And I started doing that maybe 10, 12 years ago. I'm originally from Lebanon. I grew up in Beirut during the Civil War from 1975 to 1990. And this is where I had the first chapter, or the first essay I wrote that eventually ended up in this book, was called The Beachcomber. And it's about these people who go to the beach every day during the war to create new meaning, to find the valuables at the beach. Because the city became impossible to live in, the violence was all around, and the beach was the only outlet for people who were encircled by war and siege. And of course, there was an image of Gaza a couple of weeks ago of people who went to the beach on an April day to breathe, to reinvent their life when their life was being completely destroyed otherwise. So this was for me like where this book started, with this idea of how do we invent rituals that allow us to survive in these horrible circumstances. But the idea of actually writing the book, saying I need to turn this into a book, was during COVID and the lockdown, because that lockdown also brought me back to my childhood in Beirut, when we didn't know if we were gonna live or die. We didn't know what was going on. We didn't know, how is this going to end? And also our access to water, our access to food was in jeopardy. So the book is called Water on Fire, this idea that water is something that is you go to the beach, it is the sea, it is freedom, but it is also water as something that you absolutely need in these times of crisis. And the other chapter that I wrote during COVID, and I said this is going to be the book, is a chapter about my mom storing water in these bottles. And she filters the water. And because the water we get from the faucet is not clean water, so it has all kinds of impurities. But I used to observe my mom as a kid, storing these bottles of water and letting all the impurities go to the bottom, so that it clears all the impurities, and then she drinks it. It filters itself. And I felt in these times of crisis, we need also tools to allow us to survive. We need little tricks that allow us to filter the poisonous, filter that which scares us. So this return to childhood, this return to these practices is also a way to survive in really very difficult times. So this is how the book started, and hopefully people will like it.
Grace, I know you worked on this memoir for a long time.
A very long time.
So yeah.
More than 20 years, actually. I would say it started out really as a process of self-discovery and exploration, and realizing that I didn't know many people that had a background like mine. So a little bit of backstory. I was born in Taiwan, and when I was 2 years old, my parents moved us to New Jersey. And my parents actually had been graduate students at Princeton. So they had lived in the US for a decade before I was born. And so therefore, we were not like other immigrant families. And then when I was 9 years old, our family moved to Hong Kong. And then I completed my education at an American school there. And then I came here to attend UC Berkeley. And even though I thought, I was going to find kind of the most diverse group of people with very different backgrounds, I actually didn't. And I think I struggled to find a sense of belonging and commonality with other people. And so it all really goes back to figuring out my place in the world. And the other thing to know is that once I came here for college, I never again lived in the same country as my parents or my brother. So they were back in Asia, and so that split has really defined my life. And so I had to figure out who I was here, but also what was my relationship to my homeland, and how could I develop a more direct relationship with Taiwan, where I was born, that wasn't completely mediated through my parents.
Leta.
Yes. I wrote my book, The Kneeling Man, My Father's Life as a Black Spy Who Witnessed the Assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., really to answer 3 specific questions that had implications not only for me personally and for our family, but really for the country and for history. And so the first question was, what kind of man is my father, Tarek McCollough? The second question is, why was he kneeling beside Dr. King on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel on April 4th, 1968, in the last moments of Dr. King's life? And then the third question was, how did this black man go from Jim Crow, Mississippi, to spying on a black activist group and at the scene of Dr. King's assassination, and then go on later from there to a career at the Central Intelligence Agency? And so, these were questions that I had spent my life running from until I got to the point where I realized that, it wasn't fair to me, or wasn't fair to my children, rather, to pass on to them these silences about these topics that I had lived with. It wasn't fair to them. And so the answers that I got to these questions really took me on a guided tour of the arc of the history of black people in America and the efforts of marginalized people everywhere to try to get free.
You really want to read all 4 of these. Thank you. So I'm going to ask questions of our individual panelists, but also, many of these questions could be directed at anyone. So everyone's going to jump in as the spirit takes them. Grace. So the emotional terrain of writing about family is, daunting. It can be treacherous. It can be incredibly fulfilling. And sometimes it brings us, closer to an understanding of our parents. But also, in your case, as you already alluded to, there's a real process in the book of establishing yourself separately from them. Can you talk a little bit about that sort of emotional terrain as you discovered it over sort of the long period of time that you worked on the book?
Yeah, so I think I actually have one advantage that many memoir writers don't have, in that the people that are most principally represented in my book are no longer living at the time that the book comes out. But of course, I wish they were. And the book is written from a place of love and reverence for them. But there was a lot I did not know about my parents. And I think, any young person going into the world probably takes a while before they actually start to see their parents as people and not just parents, and starts to really question some of the circumstances of their lives. So one of the things I discovered about my parents that, of course, affected me greatly was the fact that The time we lived in New Jersey, we were basically in exile, from political repression in Taiwan. My parents left involuntarily, and the consequences of that move, they did this to keep our families safe. However, what that meant was that growing up partly in New Jersey and then continuing my education in English in Hong Kong, it meant that I was forever distanced from my homeland because I forgot my mother tongue and was only speaking English. And my parents at that point were already multilingual, and so for them it wasn't really a problem. They would just speak to me in English, and so I had this kind of ease growing up, and I kind of took for granted this international context and background that we had, and so that made it. It took until my early adulthood to realize the sacrifices that my parents made, and to realize that there were difficult circumstances that they were escaping. They were making this decision to keep our families safe, but what that meant was ultimately it created distance between me and Taiwan. And the other complicating factor in my book is that over the course of writing it, it started out as a story about reconnecting with my Taiwanese heritage and identity. And I thought that was really kind of, the entire topic of my book. But then my parents both had serious illnesses, and my mom in particular was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And so just at the time that I was starting to really explore and interview them and do research and spend more time in Taiwan, my mom was slipping away slowly over a period of years. And so it became even more urgent for me to try and learn about them and to understand who they were as people, even as I was in the process of losing them.
Leta, you also have a profound investigation, as do all of you, but yours really has the flavor of an investigation because your father's professional life was a clear, like an established secret throughout your entire childhood, right? And it's really as an adult that you sort of had the bravery to say, I need to know this. And maybe just not me, maybe everyone needs to know this. But can you tell us a little bit about sort of the process as a, you're sort of both a memoirist and a journalist in this story. And that's a tricky undertaking, right? There's some aspects of conflict in trying to wear both hats. So just tell us a little bit about sort of that process, because you really did not begin to learn the truth about your father's professions until you were an adult.
That's right. And you're exactly right that I found myself wearing these two hats of, journalists on one hand, trying to run down facts, get the who, what, when, where, why, but also investigator. And I think that the investigatory side of things had kind of almost a legalistic flavor to them. I mean, there were just sort of the logistical mechanics of getting documents from the government. There were police department records from the Memphis Police Department that I knew had been incinerated by the police department back in the 1970s. So those were gone. So the only other place where records resided was with the FBI, and those FBI records had been passed on to the National Archives. So I had to go through the administrative process of filing a Freedom of Information Act request well in advance, because those take a long time if anyone else has ever tried to do that. Doing the FOIA request, I wound up in a little administrative battle, which I won, to get those documents on an expedited basis. So there was that kind of nuts and bolts technical side to things. There was the journalist side to things of interviews. The most important interviews really were the interviews with my father, which began in late 20 2015 and continued through 2022. So that's almost 7 years of talking to him. And of course, I couldn't just talk to him. I had to talk to, for example, the people from the activist group that he infiltrated. I talked to Kobe Smith, who was one of the co-founders of this kind of Black Panthers type group called the Invaders. We talked to Ambassador Andrew Young, who was also on the balcony with Dr. King. But I would say in investigating this story, talking to my father, definitely, I think part of the reason why it took so long was that we weren't just building a factual record, but we were also laying down some roots to our relationship, which had been stunted because of these years of silence. And so what developed there wasn't just this rich story that I got from him, but also this fully blossoming relationship at the end of the process.
Can I ask a follow-up question? So, in your conversations directly with your father, because to be able to go to a primary source is, a remarkably strong opportunity. What was most surprising in either from the text or just in your gut of what you learned directly from your father?
The most surprising thing that I learned from my father was just how clearly he was personally bifurcated. It's sort of this idea of double consciousness that was articulated by the scholar W.E.B. Du Bois as a Black person and an American, and sort of this defense mechanism that many of us have to develop, where on one hand you have your identity, you have your inner self as a Black person, but then on the other hand, your public-facing self has to be separate from that to survive the institutions and the culture that we have. And so I was really surprised at how almost neatly my father was bifurcated, and the way that he was able to set his personal feelings about what he was doing and sort of the civil rights actions that were going on around him, set that aside from the police work that he had to do and the task at hand, to the point where he literally took on a false persona to do the job.
Amazing. Sylvia. So I think that for many memoirists, certainly, for many people working on first-person narrative, figuring out their narrative arc is among the most challenging things. Some people know it right from the jump. I had the gift of really just trying to depict a year, and a year is a very tidy amount of time, but all of you are writing about much longer periods of time, and trying to figure out a narrative arc that is going to work is hard. So you have written many, many books and many novels, and this is your first memoir.
Yeah.
So I'm very curious about what the process was like for your discovery of the narrative arc that works for this. It's a complex narrative arc in this wonderful book, and it tells you the story of 3 generations of a family. Right. So what was the process? How many drafts?
Right. An uncountable number. The discovering the form of the book was part of the process of writing, for sure. I just want to say I'm really so interested to hear what Grace said and what Leta said, because in a different way, because I was writing about my father died in 2018, and so I didn't have a chance to interview him about his life. But I was really making a lot of discoveries in the writing about the world he'd come from, which he had been very secretive about and hadn't told us anything about. But also he was also losing, his cognitive capacities, and so that feeling that the person is slipping away from you. So there was something about, I was trying to make in a way, my father's story whole, or create some kind of wholeness out of these family fragments, and out of a family that had broken apart a couple of different times because of divorce and because of people turning away from one another. And I feel, listening to my co-panelist, for putting in a plug for storytelling, because storytelling is the way we create wholes out of these different parts of our lives. And there were certainly points in the writing of this book where I wasn't quite sure I was going to be able to capture it all in one whole. But one of the decisions I made, which was sort of a risky one, but I'm glad that I did, was that when it came to writing about my father and this remarkable place that he lived in the wilderness outside of Ukiah, I knew that if I was going to be able to really describe the place and my father, I was going to have to write some of those sections as short stories so that I could free my imagination and sort of imagine what it was like to be this man who was kind of a reluctant father who'd wanted to be a writer. He hadn't succeeded in his writing life, but he really, with his second wife, lived this very adventurous, colorful, amazing life out in the wilderness, which he invited my brother and me to join him in at some points. And then when it came to also trying to capture the life of my grandfather, who was a man I obviously never knew. He died in 1938. I was reconstructing him from letters and descriptions of him and the 2 novels that he published in his lifetime. It also eventually became clear to me that I would also be able to get at the meaning and repercussions of his life through some short stories as well. So eventually it became clear to me that the story would be my own discovery of my family stories, and that there would be these excursions into the characters and lives of these 2 men. And that the place that I did reach eventually was sort of coming to a kind of piece about my father, not by virtue of him still being around, but a kind of piece nonetheless, you know.
So it's interesting you mentioned the form of a short story. And Tarek and Grace, you both mentioned the form of the essay when you were talking about the intention of your writing. So, sort of a broad question to anyone who wants to jump in is, any of the and all of you do other kinds of writing in addition to memoir. So sort of hearing like one thing distinguished or described as an essay, tell me about the forms that you have worked on in the past, or maybe even worked on simultaneously to this book, that informed the work of the memoir.
See, for me, I had to move from the academic, where the I had no place, to bringing the I into play. And once you do that, it tells its own story, and you also have to follow it. And you see the layers that it reveals. And so the essay, in a way, like in one of the essays, I heard this voice, this person saying, "My name is Shafi'a." Like I heard this voice, and I followed that voice. It's almost, so the essay here is, we're talking about investigation, we're talking about also writing itself as a process, is something that opens these portals. And this is a concept that's very important for me. These portals, these doors, and that brings the layers and brings the generations. And I was talking about the dish, and all of a sudden about this aunt, my father's aunt, who used to come to our place to cook a very special dish, this pudding. And it's a chapter called Toil and Trouble, and of course the allusion is to Shakespeare, to Macbeth, And so the kid is watching this older woman, stirring the pot. And of course that process is also a process of writing, of peeling, that then starts revealing lives and stories about the First World War, about famine, about why this dish was made, but also about a whole generation of, this woman who was married 3 times, her husbands keep dying, and she has to raise the kids by herself. And this dish becomes like a nourishment for that, but also a way that connects different generations and different political moments and different historical moments. And so this essay, this writing, is something that you have to be very vulnerable in order for you to capture it, in order for you to allow it to take you where it wants to take you. And this is really what surprises you also at the end. I didn't know where I was going with this. There was only a voice that was coming to me, and I was just following it as if in the dark, as if groping. And so the essayistic form really is that which allowed me to do this without completely controlling at the outset what this chapter was going to be about, or the part of the story that was going to be about.
That dish, as it's described in the book, is so intriguing, and I think it's very difficult to make, correct? So, but it sounds delicious in the book, so I was like, ooh, can I make it? What about you? I mean, I don't know how you think about the essay or any of the other forms, because you've written in many different forms in relation to this manuscript.
Yeah, so the book is, I would describe it as hybrid, kind of blended approach. For me, I found it really difficult to write all in one voice and all in one style in a conventional memoir format. And so for most of the, many, many years I spent on this book, I really struggled with structure. How am I going to write it? And so what I did was I just tried many, many things. I have written fragments and poems. I have a chapter that's called Album. That's maybe not dissimilar to Sylvia's short stories, in trying to construct a life for my parents. I imagine myself into the life they must have had as graduate students in the United States before I was even born. And so I have a chapter that's a braided essay of like 2 different strands, and I'm writing film reviews. I have a chapter that is aligning moments of my life with myths and folk tales. And so I had to try all of these different things, and I didn't know if it was going to work, if it was going to fit together. So I actually want to quote someone who was also speaking on a panel earlier today, another wonderful memoirist named Faith Adiele. It was actually at this festival last year. She said something that I was like, oh my God, that makes so much sense. She said, hybrid lives need hybrid structures. And I was like, that's it. That's the solution. So even though I had actually already turned in my memoir at that point, I was like, oh my gosh, that is the perfect description, because so much of what I'm writing about is about not belonging, is about not fitting in. And so in the end, it actually made sense that I had all of these different attempts, and that it was, ultimately just like a very non-conforming manuscript, that I had to try on all of these different approaches, all of these different voices, because I couldn't find just one way, just like I am not just one thing. And so it's embracing the multitudes, I guess, was my approach.
Love it. I could ask this question of anyone in the panel. The question about the personal and the political. And not all memoirs, necessarily take that on, but most of these do, in one form or another. Tarek, your book is lyrically beautiful. It really is. Even as it deals with your survival of war as a child, the war's impact on your family. And we're here in a moment where some of the world is very focused on the slaughter of children in war and the future of those children and their families. When we think about the personal and the political, and I want to start with you, but I'd love to hear from all of you. What do you want people to take away from your story told in this book?
It is precisely what, these children have names and have histories, and they have families that are complex, and also wars, and these kids also have a voice. And the kids, we talk about the kids that die, but there are also the kids that survive. How are they going to live with the scars of war? How are they going to live with trauma as well? And so for me, the book is also, it describes this violence. I mean, I was, in Beirut during the Israeli invasion of 1982, which pretty much looks very much like what we're seeing today: encirclement, bombardment, no water, no food, and there are, descriptions of this. But also, like, how do you survive this? And this is something we don't hear about, we don't talk about a lot. We talk about the death but there is also the survival, which is also extremely difficult, and how you keep your humanity coming out of a situation like this. And this is what I feel the book, The Personal, is trying to bring into the political by saying there is a humanity that needs to also be recognized and talked about, that's in a model of how the human also finds a way to survive even in the darkest hours.
Yeah, and you talk so beautifully in the book about the dispersal of your family, dispersal of people to various places. Your book takes us to many different countries in the wake of the worst of the war. And Grace, I really think that also reflects on you, and your family was directly impacted by the threat of political violence. So when you think about the personal and the political, it's not only about Taiwan, but it's also about the politics of your life here in this country. I wonder.
So there are some parts where I write directly about how politics affected my family. So in particular, I was writing about a pivotal election that happened in Taiwan and the emergence of Taiwan's democracy. And what's interesting is now today, we almost take it for granted. And it's, a lot of people don't remember, and younger people don't remember that it wasn't that long ago. It was certainly within our lifetimes that Taiwan was under a dictatorship. And in fact, until it was surpassed by Syria a few years ago, Taiwan was under the longest period of martial law in the world. And so, my parents' generation, I guess, didn't talk about it that much. And so this was one of those things where, like me and my cousins and people that are like my age, like we had to find out about it not from our own families. We had to learn our history through, reading books or seeing films, and kind of discovering it in different ways, just because it wasn't really spoken about. But I think the other way in which, I guess the personal is political is I feel like when I'm writing about my situation, being a member of the diaspora, living on my own in this country, without really many family members nearby. And so I had to kind of establish my own community and context and sources of support, and that was really hard. And I do feel that there's a parallel to be drawn with Taiwan and its place in the world, and the fact that Taiwan is so isolated, doesn't have that international recognition and support, and is prevented from full participation in world bodies like the World Health Organization, like the United Nations, and other things. And even at the symbolic level, Taiwan can't even participate in the Olympics as Taiwan. They have to go under this humiliating banner of Chinese Taipei, which is a misnomer, and it's a disservice, to the people of Taiwan who should be able to decide their own future and not have it decided for them.
Thank you. Sylvia, when I think about your book, I think about the politics of gender and class, but I'm curious how you respond to this question about the personal and the political and where it dwells in your memoir.
Yeah, I was thinking about where I would locate it in the book, and there was a funny harmony of a sort between my grandfather and myself that writing this book helped me explore a little bit further, which is that, so my grandfather was 27 when he died in rather mysterious circumstances in Nairobi in Kenya. He'd moved there to be a journalist, but he had published 2 novels already, and the first novel that he wrote that was published in 1936 was called Star Against Star, and it was a love story about 2 women, which was not very common at that time. In fact, it was not published in the UK. It was published in France, in Paris, by the same publisher that took on The Well of Loneliness, which had been, by that point, banned. All of the copies pulped in London. And the publisher who published him also published later, Henry Miller and some sort of risky works by James Joyce. And my grandfather's novel, which probably had about 10 readers at the time it was published, but it sort of lives on in used bookstores. And I wrote a love story about 2 women called Pages for You that was published in 2001. And it wasn't until somebody who was actually researching that French publisher who came to interview me a British researcher, and he's pointed out, oh, so you've done what your grandfather did. You've written this lesbian love story, and did you do that as an homage to your grandfather? Which I didn't. I felt I was writing my own story, but it is a very it's a funny relation that I have to him. Not only as I didn't even know that my grandfather was a novelist until I was 21, although I had been wanting to be a writer myself since I was a child. So I don't think we wrote our books from the same place, actually, but it is I think in our different ways we were rebelling in different ways, but probably related ways. I will never know why his imagination took him to that place for his first. He was 21 or 22 when he wrote it, and married to a woman. But it was intriguing to kind of reconstruct that part of his imagination and his life as well. So that's what I would say about that.
Leta, I was fascinated reading your book about what you've already referred to with your father, this bifurcation of self. And in the case of your book, you have these, so explicitly political, entities of, the police, state violence, of the CIA. And I think the thing that I'm very curious about is your own relationship to the politics of your, of the narrative that's contained in your book. And I wonder if you'd talk a little bit about that.
Yes, and I have very complicated feelings about the politics in this book. I mean, of course, as a Black person in America, I mean, my very existence is political. The fact that Black people have strivings, the attempt to thrive, on the part of Black people is politicized. And so that is something that I've been aware of from the earliest age. And it's something that I carried with me, and I think that was a lens through which I viewed this story. And also even this country. I think, this body politic is very much bifurcated. On one hand, are we really going to be a country where all people are equal, or are we going to allow a status quo to continue that is essentially separate but unequal, regardless of what the law says on paper? How are we going to live that out? And so, this is getting back to this idea of double consciousness, as a Black American. On one hand, this is the country that my ancestors built, and this is where I live. This is where I'm raising my children. On the other hand, so much has happened to us here. So much is being done, and not only just to us, but, I'm talking about all marginalized people. That's a very complicated place to sit. And so, again, I just have to just come back to this idea that, what I believe in are the ideals that we stand for. We know what the practice has been. We know what the practice is. And so I try to focus my efforts on making sure that we hold this country accountable, as Dr. King said, making sure that this country makes good on the promissory note that it wrote.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to take a few questions. We've got time for a few questions, maybe 1, 2, 3 questions. If you have any questions for our dazzling panelists, we'll take either individual questions, about their own individual stories, or we could take broader questions about the construct of memoir or the mechanics of writing a memoir. But if you put up your hand, I see a hand back there. Can you stand up? So we could, yes, you. And so we can hear your question. Very loud, though. Yes. Oh wait, sorry. Here comes a mic. Sorry, I surprised the volunteer.
So you've each spoken about search, loss, and safety. I happen to have Sylvia's book with me, which I love. And I guess I want to thank you for all of you for writing your memoirs, because it's such a personal act to share with us readers. So in Sylvia's book, she speaks of a character and says, you build something over years only for the world to unbuild it. And then later speaks to an impersonal unbuilding of all that you had spent your life trying to shelter to keep safe. So I wanted to ask you, anyone on the panel, or Piper, when you write, what does it take? What helps you to feel safe?
That's a great question. Who wants to go?
Well, I think at the beginning, the blank page is the scariest thing in the world. So in a way, by overcoming that moment where you look at yourself in the mirror and you are terrified, so anything past that is a movement towards safety. So, and I think at the end, as the writing kind of takes shape and as the story takes shape and you begin to recognize where you're going, and this is where the safety comes. So comes through the process.
I love that.
I just want to say I was listening to a panel earlier, and R.O. Kwan, the writer, was speaking about her new book, Exhibit, and she was talking about having very deep and extended panic attacks during the writing. So sometimes writing takes you to safety, but through something that feels very dangerous and risky. And there's certainly, I think I would imagine probably for all of us, when you're revealing things in a memoir, there are going to be places where you're writing something where you think, am I really going to put this out in the world with this description in it, this revelation in it, or this confession in it? So, but then you do push through that. And then it's on the page, where it's a little bit less dangerous.
I was listening to the same talk earlier today, and when she was talking about that, I am not prone to panic attacks, except when I'm writing. In the back with a visor. Wonderful. And I think we've got a microphone somewhere. Oh, we've got time for one more? No, we don't have any more time for any more. Yes, we have time for you.
Hi. What latitude did you give yourself, or what creativity did you bring to talking about those family members and ancestors that are no longer living, and telling their story and making it beautiful, but knowing you needed to add to it? Anyway, how did you do that? I hope I'm making sense.
Yeah, how to honor the loved ones and yet be truthful, if I can interpret your question.
I think all of us as writers writing about our lives and people in our lives do have a responsibility to those people. And so it was important to me. I guess I was not writing about like a history of abuse or trauma or anything where I was implicating my family. So in that way, maybe it was a little bit easier for me. But I guess the best way to express this is that my book is dedicated to my parents, and it's what I give back to them. So everything about who I am is inherited from them. And there, in the chapter that is on mythology specifically, I talk about the myth of Inanna, who is a Sumerian goddess who goes down to the underworld. And she dies a symbolic death and is brought back to life by her servant, Ninshubur. And it occurred to me that this was what I was trying to do, in the writing. And I don't know if it's successful, but it's meaningful that I made the attempt, that, you know, this was talking about my mother and her long and slow and painful decline. And I thought, this is the way I give her back to herself, is by preserving her in writing.
That is a beautiful way to conclude this talk. Thank you so much. Can we give an enormous hand to these wonderful writers? They will be signing their books with Books Inc., correct? Yes, Books Inc. So you want to read these books, whether you get them today, get them to the library, whatever you do, but I advise you to get them today, get it signed. So all 4 of our authors will be signing their books, and thank you all so much for coming and your kind attention.
Hey, can I ask any?